So some of you had asked about how I tie up the Chalmette rig, and I thought maybe the easiest thing to do would be to do it in a video so you can see what I'm doing. So this is the Chalmette rig, as you see sitting here. We've got a main line, in this case braid. I've got a barrel swivel tied on. I've got a barrel swivel and snap, which is just run through the main line. And then to that snap, I'm tying on some kind of sinker. This happens to be a Lindy no snag, 3/4 ounce. I use other sinkers as well. Here's the same brand, Lindy. This is actually a rattling no snag. The one thing about these is that they sit up when they're down. So they'll sit in the bottom, they'll peg down, they'll kind of sit in there. And the reason that I like that is that when it's sitting in the water like that, the line, when a fish grabs it, the line can pull through easier without the fish feeling the weight, but allowing me to feel the fish on the end of the line. So that's why I like these weights. And I like the rattle feature as well. It's a bit more noise, a bit more attraction for the trout. So from the mainline barrel swivel, there's a leader. It goes to a floating jig head, and then the leader continues on, goes down to just a hook, a finesse wide gap hook, and then a bait. And you can use a variety of baits here, but and I have transitioned to just hooking them in the head, almost like you would a live minnow, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I want to interject a little comment here, and that is that you can hook a bait through the head by the point of the hook going in through the top and down, or from the bottom and up, and that is determined by the shape of the bait. So a matrix shad you hook from the top down to get it to float upright, and there are other baits that I've tried that you have to hook it from the bottom up to get it to float upright. But so then in its basic form, this is a Chalmette rig. It's a single leader from the mainline barrel swivel right down to the finesse hook. Well, I'm just going to tie one of these up, and so you will see exactly what I do. Start with mono, just a Stren 17-pound mono. And the reason I use mono instead of, say, fluorocarbon is that I want these baits to float or suspend and slowly drop in the water. You know, with this floating jig head, your jig head is going to float, and then this trailer on the back here is going to drift behind it, and they're supposed to be floating to make them look more natural. So when you jerk it, they'll dive down, and then they'll float up, and then they'll suspend there. This one will drop slowly normally, but this one will kind of stay suspended, so you get some movement, separation in the water column. And so I use the mono instead of fluoro because I don't want it to sink. So take a piece of mono about 3.5 foot long. I don't typically actually measure this. I just eyeball approximately what I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie a Palomar. So come through, and you can look up a Palomar knot. Probably most of you already know what that is, so You can look up more on that, but I take it to the midpoint, so I have two equal length tag ends. Tag ends that are both equal length. So then of course with the Palomar you have to feed back through the way you went in. So I'll feed back through. One of the tag ends. Then I get my loop. Do the circle back over the bait. Pull the tag ends tight. Okay, so now I've got my floating jig head. I've got two tag ends. One is shorter than the other one now, which is exactly what I want. So I'll take the shorter tag end. I'm going to come from the top, go through the eye, through the top, pull it through. That's for the leader. But if you come from the top, you see how nicely it hangs now, because this will go out the back, the leader will go out the back, and it'll be separated and hanging out the back of the floating jig head, because the floating jig head will be up in the water a little bit, the leader will be back and it'll float down, so it won't get tangled in the line, because it won't get tangled in the hook, because it'll clear the line as it falls down. So that's my basic knot. And this, of course, this tag end, I'm going to tie a barrel swivel, which like this, which will go to the main line. So then on the leader end, just take my finesse hook. This is a real short shank hook. And I'll show you the package here in a moment. I tie a improved cinch on the leader hook. And the reason I do that is because these things I have to build myself, the floating part. So if this thing, I'm floating this thing on the bottom, and sometimes I leave it out there and I let it float. I let it sort of sink down to the bottom if I'm fishing slow. So this leader hook might get snagged on something on the bottom. So if I can't get it off of the snag, I want this knot to be a little bit weaker than my Palomar, and I'll tie a Palomar on the main line on the barrel swivel as well. So this will break off at the leader, and I'll still keep my floating jig head. And especially you want to keep these things. If you're using these Lindy things, they're like $4 a piece. So you want to try to keep your these expensive sinkers for sure. Okay, so that's how it's tied up. It's not that complicated, but the Palomar knot and feeding it back through the top of the eye is important. Now you'll notice though with this hook, this hook actually turns out to have an advantage over your typical jig head hook. The jig head hook, you'll see the orientation of the eye is sort of in the same plane as the radius of the hook. But with this hook, it's not. It's actually 90 degrees turn. So that's a much better setup for the floating jig head, so I can feed that back through the leader line for the leader hook. Alright, I want to show you what hooks I'm using. This is the hook I use for the floating jig head. It's a Gamakatsu, just a worm hook, a 3/0. You see how long the shank is on that hook. And I need that length of shank so I can apply this line float. to it. And I'll talk a little bit about how I do that too. I'll just show you that's the hook for the floating jig head. I like this one for the leader. Again, a Gamakatsu Finesse wide gap, and I'm currently using a 3/0. I've used 4 and I've used 2. This is the little 2/0, which is, there's some advantages to that too, primarily being lighter weight. So if I don't want the bait at the leader to drop so fast, I want to give it more buoyancy, then this smaller, lighter hook is nice. But there you go. Those are the hooks that I like to use on the back. Okay, somebody, one of the commenters asked me about how to get these floating jig heads. He said he was having a problem locating them online. And yeah, no kidding. I looked and looked for floating jig heads, and it's hard to get anything that you, as a inshore fisherman in South Louisiana, would take seriously, would consider as a serious hook. But these are the floating jig heads that I started with, and I fished for a few years with them. And they're supposed to be a 2/0 hook, but they're real thin. They're a thin wire, and they have this little flotation head on top. I have actually added this spring keeper for the soft plastic to screw on there. So I bought that separately and added it to this. But these are very fragile. I've caught a lot of fish. I've caught hundreds of trout on this. But if I hang a 6-pounder on this, I don't know if I'm going to get it in. So I was never comfortable with this. Plus, after 50 fish, this head, which is very fragile, starts to get loose, and the fish can just tear the head right off at some point. So this is the best one I found, which I fished with for a long time. I did find this hook, this floating jig head. It's got a better hook on it. You know, here's your standard Gamakatsu lead head, which I would use. This hook is much smaller. By comparison, you can see how small this tiny little guy is compared to what you're used to using. But I don't like this gigantic head on this thing. It's ridiculous. Big bulbous head. I think it looks pretty ridiculous. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about how I build this floating jig head. Again, using this long shank worm hook. This pink thing you see here, or orange, you know, whatever, I use a variety of colors, is actually called a line float. So it's a piece of flotation. It's a 1/4 inch in diameter, about a 1/2 inch long. What I do is I take the line float and I cut a slot in it with a hacksaw. I'll put it in a vise. I'll cut, using a hacksaw, I'll cut halfway through until I hit the hole that runs through the center of that line float. So then I've got a slot, at which point I can just take the hook and press it in there, and then I've got the float on the hook. And then I use a little bit of glue. I'll actually put glue on the shank and then move it around, get it kind of spread around inside, and then glue it just like super glue, and glue it on the bottom too. It's not perfect. The glue, these things can, you get a bunch of fish on ripping on it, they will spin loose, the glue will let go and may have to be re-glued. I've even, a few times I've tied a loop of line, basically fishing line, mono, through the slot up to the eye of the hook, and that keeps it up. So, you know, the reason that you need this glued to the hook is that when you jerk the bait and you get the water resistance pushing against it, it'll push your swim bait back off. So it wants to push your swim bait back off, and then it's hanging down, and you know, it just looks bad. You don't want that. So gluing it on keeps it from doing this. You can see this line hook. Actually, this line float is loose. This is from this is a couple of fishing trips, but I caught enough that it got ripped around. So the mono actually holds better, but it's kind of a pain to tie the loop on there. Now, one comment here about attaching the swim bait. You got to remember that on a floating jig head versus a lead head, you've got to put the swim bait on upside down compared to what you do on the lead head. So you got to, and I come from the belly, so you see how I hook it in the belly, just skim it along the bottom and come out. This isn't a really wide gap hook, and so I want to make sure I keep as much hook out of the body as possible. One of the choices you have to make on the hooks for the floating jig head is that you don't want a really heavy hook, or you're fighting the buoyancy of the bait. So you want to balance between a good hook, enough of a gap, strong enough hook, but something that isn't heavier than the line weight, than the line float, so that the whole bait will float. So that's in essence how I tie it up and what it is. I will just say a couple things if you do actually rig one of these up and fish with them, just a couple points of advice. One is that, you got a lot of leader here, right? You got about 20 inches, which by the way, I use about 20 inches on between the floating jig head and the barrel swivel on the main line, and about 16 inches from the floating jig head to the finesse hook. So I don't think I pointed that out before, but so it's about 16 on the back and about 22 in the front is what I do. But you got a lot of leader line, and you got hooks floating around, so you can get into a lot of tangles if you're not careful. One of the ways I avoid that is by stopping the bait before it hits the water, so it stretches the bait out, and I think that helps a lot to keep it from tangling. You don't just drop it in the bottom of the boat with a fish on it, because the fish will thrash around like they always do, and it will wind these things up in a second. You won't believe the kind of bee's nest that a fish can make out of these leaders. And sometimes if you get a bad leader, it usually involves this main line, because I use the braid for sensitivity, and the braid is very small radius, bend radius, so it's very easy for it to get tangled up around the mono and the hooks and just make a big mess. So I'll just cut off the main line at the barrel swivel. If it's too bad, pull it out and then retie. Sometimes that's the easiest thing to do if you got a bad tangle. Also, this is not a Swiss Army knife. This isn't going to be a universal rig to catch trout in all conditions. It seems to work the best in, say, 8-foot water depth or more, and I have caught fish in 6-foot. I've used it in 6-foot and done in certain conditions. But you know, sometimes it's just not the right rigging for the situation. The fish might not want it. It floats above the bottom. Sometimes fish might want the bait just you know, pulled through the mud on the bottom. Maybe that's what they want. So you do have to consider it as another tool in your toolbox. I will say that, you know, I called this thing the Chalmette Rig because I've been fishing it about 3 years, and in Chalmette is kind of where I developed it, in that deeper water of the Mr. Go, and it does really very well in those kind of conditions. So that deeper water, winter trout bite, it's a good bait for there. I'll also point out that, you know, originally I didn't have a leader on the back of the floating jig head, and you can fish it with just the floating jig head without the leader behind it. And if you're fishing in a strong current and you're fishing, say, cross current, that's a recipe for getting tangles. And the leader will wrap around the other hardware or the floater, so that it just becomes unfishable. So in that case, I'll just take the leader off, just cut off the leader, and then just fish with the floating jig head, which will catch you a lot of fish as well. But it is more productive to have both of the baits when you can fish it, which in most cases you can. And again, you know, the Chalmette area is a perfect example of that, where you've got a channel that the water is generally not moving really fast, and you can fish it at 10+ foot depth and control your tangles, control the bait very well. So that's a rundown on the Chalmette Rig. I hope somebody tries it and gives me some feedback. I've tried a lot of different configurations of this, and if somebody tries some yet different ones, I'd like to hear. I guess I should mention why I hook this bait in the head. You know, this thing's very floppy when it's got no hook in the center of it. The whole body shakes, and by the way, this is a matrix shad, and so it's got a lot of flop. So my idea was that, you know, it's going to look as natural as possible by hooking it in the head, and it's not going to have that artificial support in the center of it. And, so, yep, give me some feedback if you fish with this, or if you don't. But I'd like to hear how it works out for people.